This might be a controversial take, but I don't think the long-term strategy for success and growth of the space can continue to rest just on hyper euphoric speculative price action. For the most part, I think, where growth will come from will be from actually creating apps that are simple to use for the average person, where they don't even have to know that it runs on blockchain. All they know is that it resolves a problem they have, or that they didn't know they had, and now they know they have, better than any other application that is out there on the market.
What's going on, everybody? Today, I'm talking with the one and only Juan Angel. He is the head of marketing at the Fantom Foundation. He's the host of Vertical Blocks, and I truly believe he is one of the biggest believers of crypto I've ever seen. I want to understand why he believes that, and also he could give us a little bit of more insight what it feels like to be working in crypto directly. But before we dive deeper, everything in this video is just for education and entertainment purposes only. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not getting paid nor sponsored to do this interview. So with that out of the way, hey Juan, welcome.
Thanks, Professor Crypto Banana. As we were just chatting, you're considering some different brands, so I love to see the multifaceted approach here. Just before we get started, I'd like to say that it's a pleasure to be here. You've had some great guests before, so I'm really honored. In today's conversation, I'll be speaking from the capacity of I'll be representing myself rather than the Fantom Foundation. And sure, we can talk about what it's like to work at a crypto company, as you might call it. But these are my opinions, and it's not going to be solely Fantom focused. So we'll let the discussion go in whatever direction it goes. But I'm super excited for it.
Let's do it. So why are you such a big believer in crypto? A lot of people join into the space because they want to make a lot of money. They kind of think that's going to be a thing in the future, but they're not really that confident. What makes you such a big believer?
It's a loaded question. It's a big one, but I mean, it's something that I guess I spend a lot of time thinking about. And you need to have an intrinsic motivation outside of just the profit factor, I think, when you're going through turbulent market conditions and working in an industry like this, where a lot of it is having the conviction that you're on the right track, you're climbing the right mountain, right? So for me, I guess to be honest, like it started for most people or a lot of people, crypto was something I didn't understand at all when I first came across it. I just saw it as almost like, Robinhood also allows you to trade this other thing that's kind of like a stock, and it's crazy, it's Doge, it's whatever it is. And that's where it started. Very quickly after that, that was like 2017, I believe. I can't even remember when exactly it was that I first got into purchasing crypto. And this was way before I figured out what self-custody was, of course. But after that, the market took a huge tumble, as it usually does. And it was during those interim years when things were kind of quiet that a friend introduced me to or showed me one of his favorite books called The Bitcoin Standard by, I believe it's Saifedean and Amis. Gave me a glimpse into what this new standard could mean for the world. In his case, it's the Bitcoin Standard, but I expanded way beyond that, of course, over time. And as I discovered other interests in other branches of crypto outside of just Bitcoin. But I think ultimately the reason why I believe in this, going back to your original question, is because I think it introduces a couple things that are so simple and so necessary, yet they're just not here at all right now. One of those is, of course, simplifying payments, especially international payments. And even if we go and start thinking about the developing world, where a large percentage of the population is unbanked, things like just opening up a checking account and making a wire to, if you're in the US and you're a Salvadorian and making a wire back to El Salvador using something like some sort of money transfer service is usually prohibitively expensive in terms of the fees it collects. It's extremely inconvenient and slow. And yet these people have no option other than to do that. And if you're taking, a large percentage cut out of what could be life-changing money for somebody in a developing country, that starts to add up and it starts to make a difference. And I say this not just from a sort of a philanthropic angle of making the world a better place, but also from one of there is a profit motive behind it, which is that if you manage to capture the market share of the unbanked in the world, which is enormous, then that's a huge business opportunity that a lot of people are rightfully pursuing. That's one of the things. Then I think there's other things that fit into that as well, such as, for example, the idea of having custody over your own funds. There's a lot of implications as to how this makes a difference. If we go back in time and we think about just, fiat cash, people were holding their own money. They were able to make private payments between each other, peer to peer. And obviously with the introduction of digital money, with credit cards and online payments, a lot of that disappeared. And this makes a bigger difference than people think, because if you don't have the ability to be in control of your own funds, and if you're always relying on a third party to custody those for you, then you, whether you realize it or not, at a conscious or subconscious level, you have to censor the way you feel, the way you speak, the way you act. Why? Because you may have an idea that is relatively mainstream and non-controversial, but as we know, the world's changing very quickly, and it may be that something you stand for, believe in strongly, ends up in the line of sight of something much bigger and more powerful than you, and that could put your financial well-being in a position of jeopardy. So between those two things of self-custody and having censorship-resistant payment systems, as well as really being able to stream payments, I think those are two enormous use cases. And last but not least, Web3, crypto, I know there's a lot of contention around which term means what, but ultimately they allow us to form and generate new ideas for how to govern ourselves as a society. NFTs are going to play a big part in that. I think people think of the JPEG NFT as the end all be all of the sort of trendy movement or the bubble and the hype. But having digital property rights is going to be a game changer in terms of, again, how we organize ourselves, how we communicate with each other, the control we have over how we communicate with each other, and our ability to either inject ourselves into a situation, a conversation, or remove ourselves while keeping the content that we've contributed. So it's a clear transition from a creator-consumer economy to a creator is the consumer economy. And I've talked about this in some different posts I've written and on Twitter as well, but I think that the long tail specifically for crypto is going to be something that really picks up. A lot of people are focused on the big narratives. So like which large institution is doing what and what partnership is leading to what. What they're not thinking about is that some of the biggest companies in the world have been built off of targeting and serving the long tail, from Amazon to many others. And it starts from the bottom up sometimes to have these organic network type movements that can actually form economic moats. So that being said, decentralized ledger technology, blockchains, are a fertile breeding ground for people to take something from idea to concept and actuality without having to ask for permission for a middleman, without having to ask wait around, without having to have large amounts of overhead capital that are not readily accessible to a large percentage of the world. So yeah, there's a lot in there to unpack, I suppose.
Do you think that large institutions realize that this is a game changer and do not want to see this happen, or they want to at least be positioned so that when this does convert over to crypto and other decentralized assets, that they're going to be like at the foundation, they're at the core of it, ready to capitalize the most from it?
This is my guess because I can't really say for sure, but I'd say that there's some that are more forward thinking that want to be well positioned to take advantage of this technological change. And even if it cannibalizes a certain part of their business or the revenue structure, it at least enables them to open up new doors for commerce in ways that they may have not thought of before. I also think there's a subset of these same legacy industry giants that are opposed to this because they see it as a threat. They see it as disintermediating their position in the market, and they'll do everything in their power to stop it. However, as we've seen with every single technological innovation from the printing press, anything that came before and everything that's come after, stopping the continuous evolution of technology is a very difficult thing to do. And it's usually a futile attempt. Even, going back to the example of Amazon, Bezos was a huge believer in the future of reading being digital and being able to have so many books in one portable tablet. And there were a lot of companies that were in that race at the same time. I believe this was around like 2005, 2006. A lot of them just failed at then because the first product that came out just wasn't consumer ready. But Bezos stuck through with the vision, and here we are today. So with this downturn, a lot of players are exiting. A lot of others are seeing this as an opportunity to get in and really establish the right foundations for long-term success. I'm curious to see the battle between these two, and also to see how the ones that do adopt it end up adopting it, and to what degree they stick to the ethos of what this is supposed to represent. And we can go into that further as well.
But the time it took for Amazon to get to the place where it was top dog was quite a long time. So even though when you look at history, you could say, what was it, like 10, 15 years? You say, this is incredible how much that company grew. But somebody that's watching this video into crypto saying, I'm invested in a certain coin in a crypto, I don't know if I can necessarily wait 10, 15 years or I have the patience to do that. What would be your response to that?
My response would be that first off, I never give trading advice because personally I'm horrible at doing it. Any of my investments are longer term investments. But I think, to be honest with you, part of the problem of what's going on in crypto is that retail is so directly involved with things that should be abstracted from them entirely that they're concerned about things like this. And this is why you have these huge waves of social engagement and interaction based on price action rather than anything else. Like Reddit continues to be Reddit and it continues to serve users regardless of Reddit's price on the stock market, right, for the share. And so part of what you're seeing today is that users are so directly exposed to the price volatility of low liquidity tokens relative to global market share of other things that they're emotionally invested in ways that are not necessarily conducive to a long-term healthy product development and user acquisition strategy. And what I mean by that is, even as you start to think about things like gas abstraction and account abstraction, it may begin to happen that people use Web3 or crypto applications without even necessarily knowing they're doing so, and using it because the product solves a particular use case better than anything else out on the market. And in that case, they don't have to be exposed to the price volatility of the token underlying it. There can be experts and teams that focus on managing those treasuries. And at the end of the day, it's the user who's simply using an application that actually makes a material difference in their day-to-day that ends up benefiting from it without having this sort of price fixation and obsession, which, is a large part of crypto Twitter, is just highs and lows and ranges of anger and euphoria of, did I buy this thing at the right time? And is it going to the moon? And it's the wrong focus. And as I've said before, being somebody who works at a crypto company at the Fantom Foundation, right now, if Fantom posts something or anybody, any other blockchain posts something, there's a ton of retail users that engage with it. And it's tribal almost to the extent that you'd see people be tribal about sports teams or bands they like or whatever else it is. But eventually it should be so abstracted that it's the same as, a push notification provider running in an app in your phone where maybe you get a notification from Spotify for like, hey, this is an artist you might like. And you say, hey, Spotify, nice job. Like, you identified a tune that I liked. But what you're not thinking to yourself is, oh man, like their push notification provider they have a contract with is crushing it. Like, I want to go interact with them on Twitter, right? These are things that should be abstracted. And eventually Fantom succeeds, which I believe it will. And that's why I'm aligned with the mission. The goal should be that Fantom's engagement is B2B. It's with developers, it's with builders. And in turn, it's those builders and those developers who are growing the market share and attracting the users to their applications, the end users themselves, for the particular use cases that they resolve.
Is it possible that right now, when we take a look at retail is invested because they are emotionally invested, they're looking to make a lot of gains. And on the other side, the people that could truly benefit, as you mentioned, people in, let's say, El Salvador trying to transfer funds without having to go through a major third party, they should be the ones that should be really focused on this building infrastructure. So I see it as almost a difference between the two. You got the wrong people in when you should be focusing on the other side. Do you see it that way?
Absolutely. I mean, it's if you look at countries like Venezuela and Argentina, which are completely destabilized because of poor monetary policy decisions by their central banks and governments, they are heavy users of stable coins, not because they think it's fun or memeified, as I like to say, or degen or YOLO or anything like that, but it's literally because they need to hedge against their devaluing currency. They want to do it in US dollars. There are USD denominated tokens on the blockchain, and they can do this in a permissionless manner and send money to their relatives abroad and vice versa. So they're already using it. Now, does the technology need to improve for more people to do it? Absolutely. That's where account abstraction is going to come in. Fantom, among others, is working on that, where for people who spend all day looking at this stuff and researching this stuff, which is still to a certain extent a closed niche, things like managing your private keys is easy. Just write it down, do this. Also, don't make any of these 30 different mistakes that will end up in complete loss of your funds. And also learn to code and also all these things. That's not realistic. I know people want us to jump to this hyper-futuristic society where everybody's a fluent Solidity developer. But the truth is the way to onboard people is by giving them options to interact with this technology with the same ease of use as they interact with any other sort of application on their mobile phone today. Yeah, developing that infrastructure to essentially bank the unbanked is one of the key things moving forward, because people in those markets, I'm sure there's some speculators like everywhere else. And by the way, just to give a caveat, nothing wrong with speculation. It's a necessary part of a healthy market and finding where prices should be at any given time, both shorters as well as people longing. But going back to the original, because sometimes I say this and people think I'm like against speculation. No, speculation is inherently necessary to maintain a healthy and balanced market. It's the people, I think, in North America and Europe who have this almost as a separate online video game that they're playing to a certain extent, of accruing points and winning and yielding and doing all these things. It's a hobby, right? It's a fun, potentially financially profitable hobby, but it's not a life raft. Like, we're not in 1984 yet. You can still move around freely to a certain extent, depending on where you are. People aren't using crypto to survive. The people who do live solely off of crypto do it because it's a particular mission or objective they've set out to accomplish. Whereas people in some of these other developing nations, they use it because that is their only option. That is the only reliable means that they have to hold their savings, to send money to family members, and to essentially, work in a functional society.
Okay, so my question then would be, how do you get these people that are unbanked to become aware of this new technology? Because if you're in these type of places, you're not hearing about this. You're not watching on the news. You're not really fully into it. And then not only that, actually putting in all the necessary steps to accomplish that is difficult for just anybody, not to mention somebody that maybe isn't so big into the space. So how do you attract more people to this new tech that could benefit them?
So, I mean, I think there's a few different ways to go about it. When you're thinking about, like, essentially this cold start problem of creating network effects, there's different ways to do it, right? So if you look at apps like Tinder, for example, or Facebook, and how they grew, they did it by essentially creating these, what Andrew Chen from A16Z calls atomic networks. So going into a college town or college campus and saying, hey, all of you are young people and you're looking to date and you're looking to connect. You're all in the same place, which fits the criteria of, what kind of users we need to have on the application. Let's throw a launch party. You all download it, you start dating, and then go campus by campus, city by city, launching it until it becomes mainstream enough that it starts to reach that tipping point where eventually word of mouth and virality spreads. And then when you join and you're in a certain town, there's already some sort of supply to match your demand. So that's one way to do it, is to literally take a atomic network approach and go country by country, city by city, hosting workshops, educational seminars. And this is something that the Bitcoin community already does really well, especially in places like Africa, Central and South America, where they have these Bitcoin meetups and they educate people on how to use it. But again, same problem as crypto has, is that some people might want to go and they might want to learn, but at the end of the day, like, have you ever tried to use, a Bitcoin self-custodial open source desktop app? It's extremely confusing. Like, I mean, don't get me wrong, they're great, but they're very difficult to use for the average person or even somebody who's in the space. So as soon as that account abstraction and technology abstraction of what's going on behind the scenes actually takes place, I think this approach will work better, because then you can have people show up at workshops and you say, hey, look, this is the benefit to you as a community to start adopting this technology. And it doesn't just have to be for payments. It can be for a million other things, right? It can be for peer-to-peer decentralized insurance. It can be for any other use case. You say, this is what it does for you. And you don't have to spend an hour diagramming how the nodes communicate with each other and, how many transactions per second and time to finality. Like, people don't need to know that. What they need to know is, how is this going to make their life better in a measurable way to start using it over the other applications that exist. And the other one is, introducing the technology as a tool and letting that tool bottoms up start to create network effects around it. So that if you look at it from, for example, Fantom's perspective, you could look at that as Fantom being this neutral technology layer upon which anybody can build anything they can possibly think of. And it's up to the market to decide whether there's value in that or not, and whether that business is going to succeed or fail. And all Fantom is the neutral infrastructure layer that sits behind it, eventually abstracted in its totality. And as people build and use this tool, it starts to gain those sorts of network effects to the point where it expands to countries outside of just North America and Europe and the other Western developed countries.
So if you had to take a guess, how long will it take until we reach that point where it's very easy for users to be onboarded, where they don't need to know about, let's say, how to handle the private keys and how to get these custodial apps?
much longer than everyone hopes and also much shorter than everyone believes it could take. So, technology's development is commonly said exponential and not linear, which means that things develop more quickly than we could expect, but sometimes our expectations are based or anchored in nothing at all other than pure hope. So even for something like account abstraction, Andre Cronje from the Fantom Foundation, I was talking about this the other day in terms of more specific timelines, and this is something that could take years to really come into effect, right? Like it could be 2 years before account abstraction is really integrated into all these different separate DeFi wallets where users can essentially log in with username and password and have social recovery as a mechanism rather than just holding their private keys. But the tech itself can be developed, and it's a matter of how quickly can it spread, how quickly is it implemented across the board. So it's hard to give timelines for things like this, but yeah, both shorter and longer than we expect.
So how do you think that retail is going to manage to survive and be patient when it could be potentially a few years? Because this has already been 1 year and we saw complete carnage in the markets and in people's interests. I would assume that if price was going to the moon, everybody was hyped, it would draw in not only retail, but then also the developers. And then this would be going at a much quicker pace. So what would you tell people that are in here for retail and they're hearing, could be another few years before this is like super meaningful and easy to attract actual users that can benefit from this?
Yeah, I mean, this might be a controversial take, but I don't think the long-term strategy for success and growth of the space can continue to rest just on hyper euphoric speculative price action. And by that, I mean that I understand that there are people here for financial motives strictly. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. If you are doing that, hopefully you know what you're doing, because this is a space where you can make a lot of money, but you can also lose a lot of money. That's the part that people forget or don't mention. And at the end of the day, those people who are in here working as decentralized market makers, people providing liquidity, or helping secure network by delegating their stake to a validator, those are all people that will continue to perform those actions, maybe because they have financial motives, they're ideologically motivated with the idea of decentralized networks and their impacts on society. But for the most part, I think, where growth will come from will be from actually creating apps that are simple to use for the average person, where they don't even have to know that it runs on blockchain. All they know is that it resolves a problem they have, or that they didn't know they had, and now they know they have, better than any other application that is out there on the market, and even including Web 2 or anything else that's out there today. And that could be the case for builders and entrepreneurs realizing, wait, actually, if I shift from this Web 2 revenue model to this Web 3 or crypto revenue model, and we're already at the stage where it's easy for me to get users onboarded simply using something like email and password, this is a better business idea for me. And then the users on their end, can also start using these applications. They don't have to know anything about the token. They're not emotionally invested in having made poor decisions as to where to allocate their capital. All they're seeing is, hey, I can purchase this like e-commerce product here for cheaper and it'll get to me faster. And then there's these network effects where I can start earning like affiliate or whatever, business model you take, direction you take it in. There's a million ways you can grow networks using blockchain. But eventually I think that's going to be the key catalyst, is that all these players that perform integral functions in making the market will continue to remain, and they'll continue to research and do what they do best. But eventually it'll be having users use applications that run on blockchain rails because they're better than the other applications that are available to them in the market.
So as you mentioned that you are a part of the Fantom Foundation, you work for that. A lot of people can see that there are individuals working, but can you pull the curtain and give some details that most people wouldn't know what it's like to work for a crypto company? Obviously, I assume that you're working remotely. You're not going into the office. Besides that, can you share some more details?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting experience, and there's something exciting every day. There's never a dull day, that's for sure. Some more hectic than others, but always at the end of the day, something that I think everybody is excited to be working on because they're ideologically aligned with the mission of why it's important to bring blockchain technology to the world and why it's important to be positioned to be the go-to product for anybody wanting to launch their application. That being said, it's a distributed team, as you said. So we've got people in all time zones all around the world. Communication is definitely something that is, takes a lot of practice and a lot of fine tuning. And I think if somebody can figure out a good way to create a one-stop shop for distributed crypto teams to communicate, other than this mix of like Discord, Telegram, Slack, email, WhatsApp, and everything else combined with several different conversations going on at once. That would be a product I would personally start using. But so yeah, when it comes to communication, a lot of it is finding this mix between being a flat team, which the foundation is, and having a hierarchy of understanding who is in charge of what and how can you leverage that resource to further the interests of the Fantom ecosystem. And so it's very different from any of the other startups I've worked at in the Web2 world, where there's very clearly delineated hierarchies and very clearly delineated roles and responsibilities, with each person doing X, Y, and Z and accountable to X person. This is much more of a bottoms up meets the top down direction, somewhere in the middle. So we have, the directives coming from the C-suite of the general vision, direction, and narrative of the company, and of course the technological developments that underpin that. And then we have from the bottoms up, individual contributors almost working on passion projects, making suggestions, and bringing them to the table for us to say, hey, let's run with that. Let's do that. I find that having a team under you and giving them the flexibility to explore their actual passions within the space leads to a much more productive and healthy working environment. And that's where I've seen people really shine, is not being told what to do, but being asked to propose what they'd like to do. And of course, as time passes, we've grown the team. Just in the last 6 months, we've hired 4 or 5 more people for the marketing team alone. And that's to work on everything from a complete website UI UX redesign and revamp to this new vertical blocks endeavor, which we'll talk about shortly, I'm sure, all the way to coordinating with partners and creating content and scheduling conferences. So there's a lot that goes into it. It's a lot of fun. And in terms of even just like working hours, I think sometimes people ask me like, oh, you work from home, what's that like? There is no such thing as working hours, because everybody's in a different time zone. You really have to like what you're doing, because it could be that you have a quiet morning that particular day, but it might be that, 10 p.m. that night, there's something important that needs to be done, and you have to be flexible for it. So it's not for everybody, but the people who enjoy it really like the way it works.
So you are in the public light. Your docs, people know who you are. And sometimes people have very positive things to say, but likewise, people can definitely have negative things to say. Do you see that? Does it impact you? Do you take that as feedback and say, okay, we're listening to what people are saying? Like, walk us through your mindset of that.
Before I address that, there's one more thing I want to add that I think is a really interesting problem to solve. And it's one that we've been thinking about lately. And it's, as I said, it's distributed. So technically my title is head of marketing, but I'm really involved in everything from partner conversations and integrations to business development to creatives and content production. Basically, you name it, I'm probably in some way involved, as is everybody else. But governance is a really interesting thing. So as we're moving away from, the mission of Fantom is to eventually become so decentralized that, as Andre puts it, it doesn't matter if we're all dead. It's going to keep working, right? Of course, between now and then, there are a few steps to make sure that everything is ironed out and in place before something becomes programmatic, automated, and perpetual. So governance and understanding the transition of governance, how to delegate important decisions and gain voter engagement across the ecosystem is something that we've been thinking a lot about, especially as more of these funding mechanisms and resources that we're putting into place will be governance led in the long run, and some already are. So that's another thing that I think every team is spending a lot of time thinking about, but for us particularly, it's something that we're exploring in detail. So anyway, going back to your comment about feedback online. So yeah, I mean, look, I'm not a huge, believe it or not, I'm not a huge social media guy. Like even before Fantom, I deactivated all of my social media accounts. I didn't use them for like 3 years. Happy about it, right? And then I realized the reality is that if you want to engage with other people and communicate with them, even if you don't like the medium, or even if you don't like the way that social networks exist today in Web 2, it's a necessity. You have to do it. You have to connect with your audience where they're at. So anyway, I just accepted that was a fact and I had to do it. Being a public-facing figure, I'd like to call myself like an E-list celebrity or lower, and that's within a micro circle already. So like the lowest level of celebrity you could possibly be. You get a lot of feedback, unsolicited feedback. And at first, when I first started speaking publicly, going on podcasts, going to conferences, making posts, I took every single comment straight to heart. Like I'm talking about, like if there was something nasty someone said to me, like I'd ruminate over it in bed, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of like how bad it felt and like how angry I was, and that I wanted to get even. And then I realized, like the people who do that, they're probably facing something in their own lives that leads them to act out. And I'm not like some self-help guru here. I'm just like, this is the realization I came to. If you're on Twitter just spitting hate at every person that comes across your timeline, and you can usually see because if one of them posts on your timeline or on your tweet and you click into it and you go to their post, they've done it to every other account as well, right? So if there's people like that, there's nothing you can do about it. Like they'll always be around. You have to accept it. It's not nice, but ultimately it's probably something going on in their own lives. It's not something you're going to be able to fix with, civil debate. So I quickly learned that, ignoring all feedback is a recipe for disaster, because to be honest, some of the best ideas and some of the things that we've taken into consideration and integrated have come from the community. Like that's what I most like about this idea of bottoms up decentralized communities, is the collective consciousness is more intelligent than the single mind, right? Like the aggregate of all involved Fantom users can make better decisions than a closed door committee of, the executive suite of Fantom trying to make a decision about a large thing just on their own. And again, there's this give and take between centralization in the early stages and decentralization early on. But in the long run, it's the wisdom of the crowd that always prevails. So it all comes down to learning to have a bullshit detector to understand, like, the person who's telling you something, are they telling you this because their interests are aligned with you and they want you to succeed and they're frustrated that you are not taking the vision in the direction that they would if they were in charge? Or is it just somebody who wishes your demise and your team's demise and the technology's demise? Because the latter is not helpful for anything. You can block them, mute them, or whatever. Just never engage, because it doesn't lead anywhere good. I promise you that. But the former, you should, like, I document all the feedback that I find publicly about Fantom. I bring it up at team meetings. We integrate whatever we can. And that's the other thing, is we're a startup, but people assume that a startup means that if something happens today, it will be executed tomorrow. No, some of these ideas take time to mature, to develop, and then they're implemented. But I can tell you that feedback that we received 3 months ago is stuff that we're doing today. And when people see it, they might even realize, like, hey, like that was something that we suggested you guys should do. Like, I'm glad to see you doing it. So yeah, that's a long rant, but that's what I got.
So I got some questions here that maybe you can disclose, maybe not. But when it came down to, I know Austin, who's now running BlockBytes, doing a phenomenal job over there. Before, he was doing Fantom community alerts, and everybody from the Fantom community was looking at that as a podcast for information, etc. Was there a particular reason why the Fantom Foundation couldn't work with Austin to have him be the source when everything was going very well? Because from my observation, it seems that something didn't click and Austin focused on different chains, and now you're filling out that void with vertical blocks. Am I correct in that?
Yes and no. So a few things. The first one is the BlockBytes team is like an extremely talented group of individuals, starting with Austin and everybody else that he's involved. They make great content. I was on the podcast like 2 weeks ago. Sam and Michael were on it yesterday. And a lot of the growth of Fantom, especially in terms of like word of mouth virality and marketing, can be attributed to Austin filling a void that needed to be filled early on in Fantom's development. As time progressed, I think two things became clear. And I don't want to say anything on his behalf that he wouldn't want to share himself. Two things essentially became clear. One is that a lot of the best content about Fantom is produced by the community. And some people say, how can it be that, all the Fantom content is from the community? Like, where's the Fantom content? Well, if we can get organic user-generated content to proliferate faster than what we can do, that means we're succeeding. That is more convincing and penetrative marketing than, brands and slogans being slung at you from the top. So that's the first thing I'd say. But the second is, we work with PR agencies and firms who, are representatives in terms of getting in the media and press releases and all those sorts of things. But they're a third party, right? Like, we work with them as trusted partners to relay our message in a way that represents what it is that Fantom is trying to accomplish. I think there came a time, a fork in the road, where two things happened at once. One was that Austin and BlockBytes, formerly FTM Alerts, was growing at such a rapid pace that they realized that there was a larger market than just the niche of very engaged Fantom listeners that had started out on the podcast. So I think, they saw it as a business opportunity to cover a wider space with a wider potential audience, kudos to them. Like they're crushing it with like, I think it's called Polygon Shorts or something like that. Polygon Quick Flip, they cover a few different chains. So in terms of like, business expansion, it was a very strategic decision on their end. And I think while that happened, we simultaneously realized that we want to have a diverse, source of content from third parties that's organically generated by builders, by dApps, by users, by communities. But if we're going to have, a media arm that is supposed to be the mouthpiece for Fantom and representative of where Fantom is going, then that mouthpiece needs to be owned in-house, right? By that, I mean that there's a lot of things that can be easily misinterpreted, miscommunicated, misunderstood. And ultimately, if you don't have the speakerphone to communicate the vision so that others can disseminate it, then you are left at the mercy of third-party interpretations of where you want to go. So I think it was a combination of Fantom realizing that it had come to a point in its growth where it needed to have a podium from which to send one clearly communicated message that could then be, remixed and spread and dispelled in different ways, but it couldn't rely on strictly third parties to be that conduit for users and builders to understand what was happening with Fantom. So it was a combination of those two things.
So earlier you mentioned that Fantom Foundation is now getting more people with partnerships, trying to market, etc. You used to be the head person of that, and now you're being able to outsource and get more of that equilibrium. So could one suggest that, hey, yes, Austin and his Block Bites was doing a great job doing it as a community growth, but perhaps the foundation could have perhaps through some money kind of said like, hey, you guys are doing such a great job. You know what? We don't want any influence, but we do want to just show our appreciation and provide a little bit of a financial incentive for doing that.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that's a conversation I'm not privy to in terms of managing treasury. But what I will say is Fantom has, between then and now, Fantom has implemented quite a few different things that could be leveraged in particularly this way. Like between the ecosystem vault and Gitcoin grants, there are ample opportunities for content creators to find ways to monetize their work. So, I mean, this is me just spitballing here, sitting here thinking of an idea off the top of my head. There's tons of researchers, people writing threads, writing content about Fantom, which is of the highest caliber. And by the way, let me rephrase that. It's the long tail, which means that by definition, there will be a lot of really crappy stuff and some very, very good stuff at the head of its own long tail, right? But for those that are at the head, a lot of them are doing it, because they want to grow their following, they want to develop a voice in the space. They're passionate about the technology. Usually not that they're looking to monetize it, but at a certain point in growth, it may be that they start getting sponsorships. It may be that other things come their way that they hadn't expected. It could be that growing that platform offers them network opportunities within the space they previously didn't have when they didn't put their thoughts out into the world. Well, with something like Gitcoin or even the ecosystem vault, like here's an idea. Why couldn't there be a DAO of trusted community members who all know each other, who commit to producing Fantom coverage and content on a daily, weekly, monthly basis that does its best to be objective and then submits a proposal to have that DAO funded for those creators to essentially continue growing their brand while getting paid to do so out of the, fees generated by the Fantom network. So even if those things weren't available at the time, when you're talking about FCAM alerts and Fantom and who could have paid who and all that stuff, they're available now, right? So I'd say get creative. Like the whole idea of where Fantom is going is that the limit is your imagination. The infrastructure and the tooling and the things you can is there, and the things you can build on it or the ideas you can bring to the table are up to you. You can submit these for a vote. And if you get people to back you, other people who would be willing to use it, who would find it valuable for the network, if it contributes to the growth of the network, then you can probably find a way to monetize it as well. So without these conflicts of interest that could arise, like taking on sponsors that then, require you to take a specific slant. And I know that's not always the case, but it's a concern for some people. So yeah, that's just me spitballing here, but things have developed.
So being a devil's advocate, because I listened to Nick Dracon's breakdown of the Fantom Foundation's treasury, and then likewise, I think don't quote me on this, Nally was then able to break down like the actual amount that would come from the gas fees. So one could say, okay, the Fantom Foundation has so much of a amount, but then looking at the actual grant that would come from that would be peanuts in comparison.
From the gas monetization?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely dishonest to say that it's a huge source of revenue right now. If you look at the all-time highs, somebody created a graph that showed it. It would have been about $40,000 a day being redistributed back to Fantom applications, right? And by the way, these are $40,000 that are not inflationary rewards. These are, fees generated by the network. So if you look at some different blockchains and their inflation vesting schedules, they're not very pretty. Fantom's inflation in 2023 is gonna be something around like, don't quote me on this, but it's 1 point something percent relative to others that could be 50, 60% in terms of distributing rewards back to the network. So Fantom is moving towards eventually becoming much more deflationary than it currently is. Of course, network effects need to pick up for that activity to kick in and generate those rewards. Like, yeah, if there's not enough transactions happening, of course, gas monetization isn't going to be a big source of revenue. But the idea is that all of these things function as different wheels and pulleys within a large flywheel effect, where one thing sets up another thing, which sets up another thing, which drives more activity, which drives more users, which drives more apps, which drives more transactions. As a result, delivers more gas fees to the applications that are using this.
Okay, so now let's circle back to vertical blocks. So now that this podcast is going to be more of a speaker at the microphone for the Fantom Foundation, why now? Why wasn't this done earlier? And now that you're implementing it, what is the goal and the hopes moving forward?
Yeah, why now is because it should have been done a year ago. But the reality is that we are a very lean team. I don't think people realize how lean we are. Andre in one of his recent posts said there's about 100 people working at the Fantom Foundation, but on the marketing and BD side, there's about altogether probably like 10 or 12 of us that work in different capacities. When I joined the marketing team at Fantom in late 2022, it was quite literally me, the chief marketing officer, and a content writer doing everything for Fantom. So establishing a podcast, building it from scratch, which as you know is very, very difficult and takes a lot of legwork, was simply not feasible there based on the bandwidth that we had. That being said, as we've hired more people and grown the team, and I also think that's something to note, is that I wish that everybody who has faced layoffs can find a great place to work, but a lot of crypto companies are laying people off, and we're on the opposite side of the fence right now where we're actively hiring for different positions across all the different departments, including marketing, business development, engineering, R&D, anything you can think of really. Now with this in place and the bandwidth and amount of people necessary to make something like this work, we have started doing this vertical blocks. Let's call it a podcast for now, because I think it's going to become something larger than that, where it's really been kind of like an awkward teenage like garage band kind of situation up until now, where we've just brought on different guests, like trying to think about what are cool topics to talk about. Like, let's pick each other's brains. We brought on NGMI from DeFi Llama, Alex from Nansen AI. We've brought the folks from TakePile and Beethoven. We've brought Covalent. So everything from infrastructure tooling to analytics to DeFi protocols. We've had the conversations essentially around like, what's it like to build a business in crypto? Like, what are your learnings? What are the takeaways? Where's your protocol headed in the future? And I think that's been fun. That's been great. I love listening to those sorts of podcasts, like the one you have, the one I'm on right now, right? The one Nick Dracon has. All of these. I love. I've been on Nick's podcast as well. I love listening to these kinds of conversations. But what Vertical Blocks is going to eventually become is going to be almost more of a media arm where you're going to have a ton of educational content. And so that means we're going to have guest presenters showing developers how they can leverage their technology and tooling to build on Fantom. We're going to have, and this is in the works right now, but a Fantom Academy, which is going to be Fantom's in-house developers essentially create an educational curriculums on how to build and launch different kinds of applications on Fantom. Over the long run, what Vertical Blocks will really be is a hub about all things blockchain. So we may end up having even at some point, and we've already had speakers that have nothing to do with Fantom. Maybe they just are building in the space. They have cool perspectives and visions and ideas. People start listening to that podcast because they want to hear it, and then they notice that, hey, oh yeah, this is backed by Fantom. What's Fantom? And then they go into that and they might find the educational content. And so it'll be a lot less of like an entertainment type podcast and more so of like a information and education hub over time. It needs to transition into that, and it still needs to find its footing.
So in this space, it seems like retail has been way less interested, probably developers, etc. And I've also noticed that there's a lot more content creators producing content. So what is your strategy with vertical blocks to essentially beat out the competition or acquire more of that attention from the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think what people are coming to realize, and like I've referenced him a couple times, but there's a infinite AMA that Andre did where he answered several questions from the community about things. Fantom isn't marketing to a retail audience. Like the retail or the end user is not our audience. Fantom is marketing to builders, developers, entrepreneurs, businesses. That's who Fantom is marketing to. We should eventually reach a stage where the only people who know what Fantom is and are talking about it actively are the product users who've integrated and launched and deployed their contracts on Fantom. In the same way that like consumers aren't going around just talking about how awesome Amazon Web Services is for cloud storage hosting. The only people who are having those conversations are the product managers who are in whoever at a company is in charge of renewing the contract with Amazon and making a case internally for why it's great. That's where Fantom needs to get to, where it's so abstracted from the mainstream that it's something that they know exists somewhere in the background, but they're not really concerned about. And where it is it's the real target audience, the businesses, the developers who are engaged with this, who are, following the thought leadership that comes out of it, and who are eventually, in their own way in charge of finding their target audience, finding their product market fit, and either making it work or not making it work. But that's where it is. It's being specific for who the audience is, and it's not just a generalized audience of like anybody in the world who wants to check out Fantom, check it out. It's, hey, it's cool if you're an end user that's interested in blockchain tech and you're interested in Fantom. But guess what? Like, this isn't going to scale by making the entire world into blockchain nerds like we are, right? Like, this is going to scale by getting the applications and the builders who are going to leverage this technology to become passionate, essentially evangelists for this technology inside of whatever team they go to. So that if they're working at one smart contract application, DApp, DAO, whatever, and they go to another one, they're the evangelists that are saying, we're going to build on Fantom because that's where we learn to code, that's where we follow best practices, and that's where we can deliver the best experience to our users and our customers. So
do you see other chains doing the same thing as you are then, trying to attract the developers and the businesses so that they build on their chain? And are they also implementing the same techniques, such as having a podcast as well? Because then that would be competition for that sector.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of teams, and I won't name them by name, that are already doing this very well. This is something where we're filling the gaps that we had. This means doing stuff also like developer workshops. This means doing all this educational content that we're producing. This means in-person meetups where we've had 3 or 4 in the last year, just for people who are building on Fantom to get to know each other, to actually form stronger bonds and connections and come up with business ideas together. But yeah, this absolutely competition. Like it's a fight for eyeballs of the end users. And yeah, so some chains might be more focused on like the retail hype and that sort of thing. But in my opinion, that's more of a short-sighted approach, because ultimately that's not what's going to win the battle here.
Do you think that we had a discussion earlier about Twitter and how you used to ruminate on the feedback, but now you've kind of gotten used to it? Do you think that somewhat helped you with this podcast, because now you're already in the spotlight? You can already have a great mindset when it comes to feedback. You're like, you know what? Let's go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 100%. When anybody asks about this, when they start presenting themselves publicly more, and especially if they're uncomfortable with it at first, the key is to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like amongst and between all the like nasty random stuff you get, there are good people with good intentions giving you feedback because they generally want you to improve, or they want whatever you're working on to improve. So it's making sure you can identify those, take it into consideration. That doesn't mean act on all of it. It just means take it seriously and listen to it and disregard the rest. And it's easier said than done, because, it's annoying no matter how long you've been in the space, but that's the only way to do it if you want to stay sane.
Absolutely. So Juan, thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure to pick your brain, get a little bit of the Fantom Foundation, also about your personal beliefs in crypto, as well as what you're doing to vertical blocks. I will be listing all the links in the description, but any closing comments before we head out?
No, that's it for now. Thanks so much for having me. I know we were overdue on this, so it's been a pleasure to come on, and we'll chat again soon.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for coming on. I'll see you guys in the next video.